Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. We've been doing these programs for a long time because the lockdown has taken such a long time. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to stop because we'll get back to normal, but who knows when. And what we've been dealing with in the lockdown is try to give you as much insight, information, and the ability to make sense of this very unprecedented period from both a legal, medical, and economic point of view. And of course, last week on Thursday, President Ramaphosa unveiled what he said was effectively the economic policy which the government was going to adopt in order to get us out of the chaos, and I use that word advisedly, economic chaos, which was caused by COVID-19. And I'm delighted to welcome back again Michael Power from NinetyOne, the strategist, an economist, and who certainly last time gave us more than a bit of food for thought. Michael, thank you very much for doing this again. I should tell you that the last time you were on, I got an enormous amount of praise, but it was all due to you. Nonetheless, I unashamedly accepted some of it myself. So thanks a lot. Can I start by asking you what your broad response was to last week's speech, much heralded as it was, although it seems to have had less commentary as we've gone on?
I think the immediate reaction I had was that I didn't want to be cynical. I wanted to look more deeply into what was being proposed because I know a lot of effort had gone into putting it together, and indeed there was the evidence of huge amounts of compromise between the various parties who must have contributed to it. So I think that the initial stance I probably would have been quite skeptical, but I pushed that aside and looked more deeply into it. And I did find one or two things that were encouraging. I have to say, on further reflection, I'm still of the opinion that it didn't really get to the heart of the issue and address the challenges that South Africa was facing even before COVID-19.
So let me ask you firstly, on the bright side, what were the couple of things that you thought were quite good?
Well, I liked the two things, I suppose. One was the idea that they're going to auction the broadband because that's an asset that the government already has and it doesn't really need to do anything other than release it and then it can monetize that asset. And the second thing was the approach towards renewable energy, which was dressed up as saying that private sector can share the energy space. But the reality was that it was Eskom has now been forced to capitulate, and that going forward we'll use our geographic position, which has got lots of sunshine and lots of wind, to create energy, thereby not hamstringing ourselves in the future if we do actually get some growth going. But at the moment, even if we did get growth going, we wouldn't get it going because we just don't have the energy essentially that we need to make it work.
So as you read that part, we'll get on to where you think the core of our problems are and which were not addressed. But as we look at the particular presentation of the president and the document that I read which accompanied the speech, are we now in a position to say, actually, this is going to happen with sufficient determination that over the next 2 years, as they promise, we're going to resolve our energy problems?
Look, I don't think it necessarily will happen in the sense of total resolution within 2 years. But yes, I do think that we're now very much on the right path. I mean, that genie is out of the bottle and Eskom's not going to be able to put it back in. So yes, we do have wonderful sunshine in the southern hemisphere. We have great wind along the west coast. And I don't think there's going to be any holding back. There's also a fair amount of private sector money that had lined up to invest in both these spaces that is now going to be mobilized and released, which is in and of itself good because that's investment into the economy.
So that's what I did want to ask you. I mean, on that particular point, as you understand it, the private sector, having listened to this and the fact that now you'll be getting this IPP sector up and running, I take it that the private sector have got money which certainly is going to make this a reality, because sure as goodness, government don't.
Oh, yes, I think they do. I think even, to be honest, there are some foreigners who are also looking at coming to this party.
Okay. So just one thing before we get on to the core. I just wanted to ask you, at some point in his speech, he sort of spoke about, I'm not sure if it was, wouldn't it be nice, or it wasn't quite the sort of same thing as he was talking about the train. It was something a little bit more real than that speed train that he was talking from Cape Town to Cairo, a couple of state nations, when he said something about, perhaps we'll be able to go the way of Singapore et al. And put certain of our efficient parastatals on the stock exchange. Did that mean that he was recognizing that at some point some quasi-privatization or something of that sort might well be permitted in government policy?
I think that, yes, I think it was also potentially a warning to the state-owned enterprises that if they didn't get their act together, then they would have the sort of protection that they're afforded by being in the state sector, purely in the state sector, and granted a monopoly. They'll have that protection removed. I think it was a two-edged sword in that regard. I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking, because there are not that many state-owned enterprises at the moment that I can see being profitably listed on the stock exchange. But be that as it's may, the very fact that that language is starting to get into his speeches, I think, has got to be encouraging, because he's got to have overcome a lot of opposition from the traditional quarters that would have opposed things like that in order to be able to say that.
Yeah, that's what struck me. I mean, as you rightly say, I suspect there's no state-owned enterprise at the moment that the private sector would be rushing to invest in if it was listed. But be that as it may. So let's then get to the point, Michael, where you suggest that when you read it, although there are a couple of good things, we perhaps found a third one, ultimately it ducks the core problem.
It does duck the core problem.
Could you expand on that?
The core problem is that South Africa needs to wake up to what is the renminbi hourly wage rate of South Africa's semi-skilled and even to some extent skilled and also maybe even unskilled labor. Because until South Africa can leverage itself properly and competitively into the hierarchy of value addedness in terms of how and at what price it contributes its labor to the global economy, we will not be able to get ourselves going. We are not a small population economy. We're 55, 60 million, depending on how you look at it. And of our workforce, perhaps 1/3 is unemployed. We need to get that workforce into gainful employment. And we need to recognize, as has been done in Kenya and Ethiopia, that the name of the game in their case is probably outcompeting Bangladesh and Vietnam. They've even had to, as it were, lowball it on China, because that's where they fit in to the hierarchy of value addedness. And that's exactly what they're doing. But I see no effort whatsoever. South Africa, with a large population, trying to essentially join the world in a productive space. We can't live by mining alone.
Now, that I accept, but for my listeners who are not necessarily economically literate, or perhaps haven't as many, as you said last time round, the economists who look to Europe and not to these countries to the north of us who are having success stories, what precisely have Ethiopia et al. Done to get themselves into the world economy in the way that you suggest we have failed to do?
Well, first of all, they've started to develop special economic zones. And I got a special economic zone report this weekend and looked through it to see where we featured in the entire report, and we didn't. The number one in Africa was in Morocco. Number two was, interestingly, in Mauritius, with the add-on that the Mauritius special economic zone was there to attract people from outside so that they could access the Southern African market, which they're doing our work for us and trying to benefit from it. We need to understand that when China got off in, say, 1990, it basically did so on the back of special economic zones. The spillover from Hong Kong into Shenzhen and the whole of the Pearl River Basin was really the foundation of China's economic takeoff. And it was done through special economic zones. We absolutely have to understand that can be done, not just for goods, but for services. There's an amazing services special economic zone in Uruguay, in Montevideo, called the Zona America, where they basically have a special economic zone for legal services. Dennis, you could even put yourself in there and offer your services all over Africa. So I think there's something we need to do to understand that in order to be connected, somehow we need to get our, and I say, renminbi wage price down to a level which is competitive.
So that basically practically means that the wages which our labor force are charging or extracting or getting,
or expecting.
Expecting, yeah. Now, expectation is crucial, that they're too high.
Not necessarily in rand terms, or in fact not in rand terms, but in renminbi terms, which points everything towards, dare I say it, the valuation of the currency, which I think essentially serves the inner core of South Africa, the first world component that's at the heart of South Africa, that the vast majority of us and commentators live in. So they can't imagine what it's like to be in the outer core. But they don't even begin to understand that it might actually be relevant being in the outer core. And so consequently, the vast majority of economists in South Africa look at dreadful things like purchasing power parity and say, well, we're fine, or in fact, we're even a little cheap. We may be in the context of that first world economy, but being a cheaper Tuscany is not what we are set up to be. We are expensive Asia, pretty much everywhere in Asia. We're expensive. And we cannot compete, and we cannot get ourselves into the global supply chain. And until we can,
how do we do that?
We need to
If
have a
you say, for example,
central bank and a treasury that understand that, as was the case in China in the early 1990s, late 1980s, that the valuation of the currency is a critical ingredient in the totality of understanding how it is that you can leverage yourself into this value-added hierarchy. And our exchange rate is too high to be able to do that.
And yet that seems to be one of the things that they are determined, that they worry about all the time. I mean, if it slightly goes low, they go berserk and try to do all sorts of things to prop it up. You saying that actually is counterintuitive. We should not be worried about that, because that'll allow us to get a purchasing parity that actually works in a global world.
Well, that's what Germany did in the 1950s, as did Japan.
Yes,
That's what the Tigers did in the 60s and 70s, the Koreas, the Taiwans, the Singapores, the Hong Kongs. And that's what China did in the late 80s, and has to a greater or lesser degree, and increasingly a lesser degree, because it's now managed to get itself very fast track itself up that hierarchy of value addedness. But nevertheless, it still understands, as it did last week, that the currency was starting to appreciate rather fast against a very weak dollar. And the Chinese central bank stepped in and essentially put a gentle brake on the appreciation of the currency. I never see that happening here in South Africa.
But what would happen to our imports, particularly inelastic ones?
Look, they would probably have to go up in price, so that if we imported freshly made pasta from Italy, it would cost more.
But that's not a big deal, because that's only for a small lot. I mean,
my point. That's my point. That's my point. That's my point. My point is that we actually have to essentially wean ourselves off certain types of imports. And sorry, we're not going to be able to take 2 foreign holidays, not that we can in the age of COVID, a year. The skiing and whatever. It just is not going to be easy for us in the future to have that continuation of lifestyle.
But does that, I mean, but what then happens? I mean, assuming we did that, the Chinese and some of these other countries seem to have had a much better educated workforce than we did.
That's probably true. And I think there is a generational thing there, but we've seen, and this is where I hold out some hope, that the standards of education in Kenya, which for long were derided, the standards of education in Ethiopia, likewise, are now sufficient for them to find a place in this hierarchy of value addedness that I'm talking about. They still have to work very hard, as they do, it's not easy, and they don't stand still. But I mean, in terms of, for instance, the tech space, most of the big guys who come in from outside, whether they're coming from the east in terms of Jack Ma, or from the west in terms of the Google tribe, they go to somewhere like Kenya and say, "Wow, this place is really happening," because they have a creativity that has taken root in the community there, partly on the back of that amazing product called M-Pesa, which has spawned all sorts of spillover effects into other areas of the digital world, let's call it. But nevertheless, you gave people the opportunity to, as it were, become technologically literate on a cell phone. It didn't even need to be a smartphone. while not off to the races, big things are happening.
I was interested, just, reflecting upon this, reading a piece this morning about one of the large, I think, clothing outlets now essentially having its own clothing supply factories, and suggesting that if you did it here, you could actually, certainly for this market, do far better than imports, because local manufacturing allows you in the clothing game to respond to fashion changes more speedily than if you actually used outside chains. So why would
it sounds to me as if you're talking about Zara there. I don't want to put you on
I was
the
talking,
spot,
I think, about is it Truworths or Foschini or one of these corporations?
Oh, but that's been the Zara model globally, and they've been able to have production
I know
facilities
that.
in Spain. I don't think we need, we need to worry about getting clothes on people's back, not necessarily, dare I say it, fashionable clothes on people's back. The reality is if we can't make these things productively, we have to look very carefully, as virtually every clothing retailer in South Africa has done. They have, I believe, a 75% rule that, or rather, should I invert it, a 25% rule that 25% needs to be sourced from South Africa. They work that very hard. And it's clear that it's not difficult filling up the 75% quota in that situation, simply because of cost. We simply, in most spaces, cannot compete.
So even if is your point that for many, if you take that particular model, the idea that because you can respond to fashion changes significantly quicker than you could if you imported, that doesn't extend sufficiently throughout the economy to get you to solve the problem. Is that what you're really saying?
Yeah, look, I'm in the grand scheme of things, I'm not actually worried about fashion changes. I'm just worried about getting people into jobs. And it's only more recently that China has started to worry about fashion. I mean, for the vast majority of let's just say the last 50 years, fashion has not been high on their agenda. That's not to say now if you don't go to the streets of Shanghai, you don't see a very fashionable bunch. You do. In fact, the way in which taxi drivers in Hong Kong pick out the mainlanders, as they call them, is that they tend to be better dressed than most Hong Kongers. So it's actually taken off in China now. Yes, I understand that logic. I think that logic worked incredibly well for a country like Spain, which obviously was the origin of the model, which was then applied across the whole of Europe. And Zara is the number one fashion retailer in the world now, and then H&M Sweden comes second, and they both employ not dissimilar models. Though H&M is not as dependent on, as it were, locally sourced material. But I'm not sure that works for South Africa. Our issue is we need to get people making T-shirts so they can be exported all over the world, like they do in little neighboring Lesotho, where 70% of the exports now are textiles.
So that brings me to the point about if we draw in slightly from the idea of the global value chain to the regional value chain, then are you suggesting that even there, Mauritius, Ethiopia, Kenya, are going to land up by basically playing the role that we should be playing?
Well, if we don't move fast, probably yes, particularly in products that actually don't really have a shelf life, like shoes and textiles. I think we'll do incredibly well in agribusiness in our region because there is a shelf life. So supply chains need to be relatively short for something like agribusiness. Not always, but in many cases. And I think we'll do incredibly well servicing Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique. But beyond that, probably not so well. But the fact of the matter is now that largest shoe company in the world, which is Chinese, has now set up a fairly major production facility in one of those export processing zones just outside of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. It's even rumored that Ivanka Trump gets a lot of her product from a factory in a Chinese-owned factory. I don't know if she's told her father that in Addis Ababa. The reality is that you get yourself into that particular hierarchy, and then you work hard to stay in it, and indeed, where possible, to upgrade the skills so that you can start moving out of t-shirts and offering nicely tailored shirts.
So if you were conceiving of the speech that he gave, I mean, he was talking about 100 billion rand for employment creation. You're suggesting that
Look, I'm talking about 100 billion rand or whatever it's going to take coming from outside to assist in the
yes,
employment creation. That's
yes,
the point, is that we don't have to limit ourselves to what we can rustle up here in South Africa. And I don't want in any way poo-poo that mobilization. It's a very noble mobilization. But the reality is that we're limiting ourselves if we think that this whole process of reconstruction can simply be born out of our own capital resources. What we need to do, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, you know, a huge portion of China's export processing, you know, giant is actually foreign owned. It's foreign companies who've invested in China, often from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So there's an element of being, you know, semi-local, I suppose. But there were Americans as well that have done it. I mean, Tesla has, you know, is going gangbusters in China at the moment. Apple too, where they're being allowed to do so. So you know, you don't limit yourself to the capital that you've got at home. You see if you can't attract capital from abroad. But to do that, you've got to essentially all but guarantee that that capital is going to be facing a profitable environment.
And does that then mean, when they talk industrialization policy in South Africa, that if you were advising them, the first thing you would be doing is suggesting that they think it through the prism of export of zones, rather than just some bland, broad.
1,000%, because they're in those export processing zones, and they obviously have different characteristics all over the world. But you go some way towards squaring the difference between your in-house domestic labor costs, which might be a little high, and the price of the product that you're producing that you still want to be competitive globally, by essentially saying, well, government's not going to tax anything. It's an export processing zone that is tax-free for 5-10 years. So you give basically incentives to foreigners to come in, to bring in their management skills, their supply chains globally, so that they can actually start selling the stuff that is produced in those zones globally. And you ask them to come in with their capital, their expertise, their distribution networks, and essentially to employ our people. And it becomes competitive, or much more competitive, once you take the idea of tax, VAT, all forms of tax out of the equation, which in these zones is exactly what happens. They are tax-free.
And would the same be true? I think one of the things I wanted to ask, when I was strange enough, the night after, or the night that he gave his speech, I was listening to an interview with Marianne Mazzucato, talking about, and I think we both agreed on the previous occasion, that she's
a heroine of mine.
Serious hitter. Yeah, she has been since the entrepreneurial state when I read that. She was saying, if you take things like, you know, not just the IPPs, but the green economy, COVID is both a crisis and an opportunity. And if you think through it, then you start developing a vision of what an economy would look like post-COVID. Certainly you'd be looking at a greener type economy. I didn't see anything about that other than the Eskom component in the government speech at all.
I think we got to start with the energy side. That's the greenest part of any equation, and that is that, you know, we can harness the wind and harness the sun and essentially create sustainable energy sources that are virtually free. I mean, the price of putting in both solar and wind at the moment is lower than putting in a new coal mine. It's lower than putting in a new coal plant, and it's lower than anything that basically Eskom can do at the moment. And so why we don't let ourselves do that, you know, is beyond me.
Well, I did see in that document, one of these documents, that, you know, within 3 months, they'd committed themselves at least to some change. Whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. But I suspect that's going to be absolutely crucial. That if we faff around again and we don't implement these stuff, then any credibility that we've got in relation to doing even the limited things is just gone.
Well, I think that's probably one of the most encouraging things in the document, which is probably not strictly speaking its intention. But that the fact is that I got the sense that they were serious. And going back to your earlier point about what Mariana Mazzucato said, you know, I've never thought that South Africa could get onto a new path without there being a crisis. And while I wouldn't want us to have to go through COVID to be that crisis, now that we've got it and really can't avoid it, let's use it. And
right,
I
so
do
Michael,
think...
Sorry, I interrupted you. Please carry on.
No, I do think that we have been perversely presented with an opportunity to break down certain structures that have impeded us from actually looking forward, and move forward in a completely different space. Just rearranging bits and pieces, and really there is nothing truly fundamentally deep about what is being proposed. Yes, there's some very nice ideas, but they're sort of add-ons. We need a core idea, a core, let's get South Africa employed again, which is what they're doing. I mean, in President Kenyatta, he's got 4 big ideas, he calls them. And one of them is industrialization, so much so that he has renamed the Ministry of Industry the Ministry of Industrialization. It is absolutely critical to all their plans. And they do it in a higgledy-piggledy, noisy, dusty way. And it's not straight in any respect. And there are all sorts of mistakes that happen along the way. But there's nevertheless an absolute belief now that getting people into factories and undergoing industrialization and moving from, as I say, the farm to the firm is exactly what Kenya should be doing. We've got to probably do a slightly more complicated restructuring as a result of almost built up barriers to making such changes. But we have to do it anyway.
But that's what worries me, is that when I look at that speech, it was a laundry list of things, most of which we've heard before. There was no vision as to what a 21st century South African economy would look like.
I couldn't agree more. I still think that we're laboring under the illusion that we're a cheap Tuscany when we're an expensive Asia.
Which is ironic, because what's the word I'm looking for? We constantly come back to this attack on sort of Eurocentrism. And what you're saying to a large degree is those people who do the attacks often are looking as a model of Europe rather than a model of what we should be doing in a continent like ours.
And if I can now add, there's not much in Europe at the moment that you can admire. I mean, they are having some extraordinary problems, and then they were there long before COVID came along, and they're going to continue to unfold as the next generation and the next decade plays out.
Could I just ask you on that? It is suggested that we're not going to be able to progress in a global world that is going into reverse, that we coupled at the tote with the global economy, and that unless the global economy is going to get out of the rut that is in at the moment, we're going to essentially we're going to catch that flu, if I could put it that way.
And I think that if that's the format for the global economy going forward, broadly speaking, that's right. But I don't think that is the format for the global economy going forward. The real issue now is that where is it that there is potentially going to be consumer demand emerging in the next decade? And about 90% of all people joining the middle classes in the world between 2020 and 2030 are going to be in Asia, about 1.1 billion out of 1.2. Yeah. The reality is that the global economy as we know it is recentering on Asia. And we should think not about being in a supply chain that's sourced out of Asia, but part of a supply chain that is increasingly going to sell into Asia. So Asia now, because its standard of living is rising, is creating opportunities for other parts of the world where the standard of living is not so high, and therefore the wages are not so high, to become part of a new globalization, a new supply chain, where Asia isn't the source of everything, but actually is the destination of rather a lot, because that's where the consumption is going to come from.
But that requires a really very significant mindset change from where we are in South Africa at the moment. In other words,
I couldn't agree more. But just continuing in our, dare I call it, bizarre, as I agree with you, Eurocentricity in this thinking, or should I say Western centricity? Because
fair enough.
We have to wake up and smell. One of the things that's happened as a result of COVID is that, as Yuval Noah Harari says, pandemics fast forward history. And what was going to be happening in the world in 5 years' time is now happening now. I've turned from being a strategist into a tactician as a result of COVID. The reality is that China will become the largest economy in the world by 2025, not 2028 or 2030. We saw its GDP figures come out. They weren't perhaps as good as everyone was hoping, but they were still very good. The only G20 economy to grow this year will be China. And I think what we have to understand is that the entire structure of globalization is going to be rebooted and recentered, dare I say reoriented, because that's where it's going. And that actually the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, whatever you want to call it, actually wants to tie us in, not just as sources of raw materials, which has always been the way in which we've rather poo-pooed the idea of being close to China, but rather the destination of a lot of their products, and in due course, beyond that, the source of products which they can no longer make efficiently or effectively. We can do it better and cheaper, which is exactly what Vietnam and Bangladesh are now saying. They've exactly fitted into that.
That brings you back to where we started with the idea of. So as I'm running out of time, would there be anything else other than that you would have liked to have seen?
Look, I would have liked to have seen some radical thoughts on South African Airways. And my view on this is that we should do as Singapore has done, declare an open skies policy, partly because we really do need to reboot, supercharge our tourism industry in the next 2 years.
Yeah, that's critical.
And say to anyone in the world who wants to fly to South Africa, if you can negotiate a landing slot at OR Tambo or Cape Town, you're more than welcome to come. Basically, you've got to pass all sorts of health and safety issues, of course, especially post-COVID. But let's go for open skies. Let's not even have a national airline, right? If you want to actually...
What about domestic travel? What about domestic travel?
Domestic travel, look, already I see that Qatar Airways is, I think, linked up with Airlink, I think they have. I mean, they'll probably they'll get back to Comair because that was their previous partner, as and when Comair, if and when Comair revives. So yes, local and regional travel will probably be done by local and regional suppliers. But globally, in terms of bringing those tourists in, particularly, dare I say it, from Asia, because that's where the tourists are starting to flow in thick and fast from at the moment, we say to anyone who is coming from that part of the world, if you can negotiate a landing slot, come. We're not going to have, the reason why is that if we did resuscitate South African Airways, we would probably have to start putting in limits as to how low fare prices could go, because we would need to protect our fledgling airline as it tries to recover. And the reality is...
Like it was up in the 1970s, regulated prices.
Exactly. Also, we just don't want to protect that infant industry in the name of, but we need to have a national champion. What we need in the next couple of years is a flood of foreign tourists coming back into South Africa. And the best way to do that, we were always regarded, dare I say it, as a bit of a high-cost destination when it came to air travel, before the likes of Qatar and Emirates and Etihad and Turkish started to upset our apple cart. Now prices are a lot more competitive, and we should leave it that way and let them fight it out.
I'm running out of time, although there's so much I wanted to canvas, but I'm going to just raise something that comes out of this last exchange we've had, which, when you speak about South African Airways, does it not mean that one of the things we should have been talking about is what the role of SOEs is in particular, whether we need all of them? I mean, do we need an arms industry, for example, sponsored by government, et cetera, et cetera? Isn't there a serious debate to be had? Which ones are we going to keep and which ones are we finally going to get rid of, if at all have any?
I remember when I was doing my economics at A-level and at university, there was a huge discussion on what were the natural monopolies that a state should run. And I think we need to re-examine that, because there are all sorts of spaces that we've got into that we needn't be in. And I would say exactly arms is one of them. But the interesting thing, of course, is there are all sorts of areas which back then I would have said, no, that's a natural monopoly. Like, for instance, telecom, which technology has essentially updated itself since then, and I'm no longer sure that telecommunications are indeed a natural monopoly. So we need to have a very, very hard think as to in this day and age with the technology around, exactly what are the national monopoly? I think roads are, generally speaking, although go to China and the vast majority of the big roads there are actually owned by the private sector. They're based on relatively low yields and profit yields over long periods of time. They're concessions. They're required to maintain them to a certain standard, and if they don't, they lose their license. And that happens with airports as well. So for all this idea that China is full of capitalist-hating communists, they've gone far further down this path than many Western countries, and especially South Africa.
Yeah, it's a debate that we should be having, because then at least you can make a decision where on earth you're going to have any state-owned enterprises and why, rather than just some blanket list where we seem to hold on tenaciously without any thought given to that.
Well, I think that one of the things was, of course, is that many of these companies ended up being lifeboats for labor. And that without having these new growth areas that I've been talking about, we needed to find other ways of soaking up the labor that was in South Africa. We had such a high level of unemployment. So the SOEs became labor lifeboats. And unfortunately, the problem with a labor lifeboat is that if you overfill the lifeboat sinks.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've run out of time. That's a rather depressing thought to end, but I have a feeling we'll be discussing further in the future, because this was very invigorating and important, and we need to have these conversations. So yet again, Michael, I'm in your debt. Thank you very much. I will, of course, shamelessly take all the credit for all your insights.
You deserve it, Dennis. You were the one who initiated the whole process.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for time.